Occasion when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and then you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. This morning we heard a little bit of an unusual reading for the lectionary. We heard from Proverbs. Proverbs is an ancient anthology of wisdom sayings, aphorisms, and advice for how to live well. The book's original audience was likely elite young men trying to find their way through Bronze Age society, especially as they learned the complicated rules of court etiquette. Today we heard this piece of advice for such young courtiers. Don't put yourself forward in the king's presence. It's better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. I suppose this must have been good advice in that time and place. Don't be overly confident or self-aggrandizing around royalty. Hold your tongue and wait your turn. It's better to be invited to a higher place than shamefully put back to a lower place. Well, I don't know that the young men of our day and age are often in the presence of royalty, but I do think Proverbs would fit pretty well in the age of Twitter. Twitter only allows you 280 characters per tweet, so you have to be able to deliver your message succinctly and clearly. So in thinking about what a 21st century proverb might sound like, I went to see what some modern advice for young men is on the internet. So here is some that I found from realmenrealstyle.com. Don't feel guilty for winning. From manlyandmodern.com. Start a side hustle. From theadultman.com. Stop giving away your power. I know it sounds like I'm making these up, but these were really the top results of a Google search for advice for young men in 2022. These are real websites with real advice. They're pretty tweetable and certainly pithy enough to be in the book of Proverbs, but it is hard to miss how different this advice is than the advice from our scripture reading today, which emphasized humility and self-restraint, not winning and side hustles. Which advice will lead to a life well lived? And if you're feeling hesitant to take the advice of an anonymous author from the 7th century BC, maybe you are more willing to take advice from Jesus, who picks up these same themes in our gospel reading for today. At first consideration, it sounds like Jesus is offering similar advice to the proverb. When you're invited to a banquet, don't sit at the highest place, but sit at the lowest place so that you might be invited up to a higher place, rather than being embarrassed when someone comes and bumps you down to a lower place. Well, Jesus wasn't talking about being in the king's court like the proverb was, but this context involves similarly rigid hierarchies. In Jesus' context, the seating chart at meals was complicated. Who sat where was a reflection of status. Be mindful not to embarrass yourself, Jesus seems to be saying. Conduct yourself with humility. But it's actually the advice that Jesus gives to the host of the party, not the guests, that reveals his deeper wisdom. Jesus says that he's telling a parable, and we know that when we hear a parable, we need to listen for the twist, the surprise in the story. In this parable, it comes when Jesus turns to the host of the banquet and says, "Hey, all your guests are here jockeying for a place of honor, but it doesn't matter anyway because you have the wrong guest list. Here's who you should have invited: the poor and the disabled, the people who wouldn't be able to pay you back for your hospitality." Why is this part the surprise of the parable? Well, it certainly would have created an awkward silence at this dinner party that Jesus is at with some religious bigwigs. Jesus is at this meal with status-conscious elites, and he tells this story about a meal with status-conscious elites, and he implies that they never should have been invited in the first place. It's the vulnerable at the margins of society who should be here enjoying this fine baba ganoush and red wine, Jesus says, because they'll never be able to throw a dinner party like this and invite you in return. To invite them to your party, you'd have to simply be generous. You couldn't be currying favor with someone who might repay that favor later on. You wouldn't be seen by important people in your community to be doing this good thing. You might not benefit whatsoever. Instead, they would benefit, your guests. Do that, Jesus says, and you'll be blessed. That's how you live a good life. A little bit different advice than don't feel guilty for winning or stop giving away your power. The path to blessing, according to Jesus, isn't through self-empowerment, it's through empowerment of others. In particular, the others who can offer you nothing because society has prevented them from accumulating wealth or means. But actually, it turns out that in some way, these marginalized guests do offer their hosts something, even if it's not reciprocity or repayment. They offer them the opportunity to serve God. Not only in the sense that God commands faithful people to be generous and hospitable, so doing so is obeying God, but also, as Hebrews says, when you serve strangers, you might be serving angels unknowingly. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is even more clear about this. When the Son of Man comes in glory, he will say, "Blessed are those who gave me food when I was hungry, and drink when I was thirsty, and welcome when I was a stranger, and clothing when I was naked." And the righteous will ask, "Well, but when did we see you naked or hungry or thirsty or in need?" And he will answer, "Just as you did it for the least of these, you did it for me." That story might sound familiar and might come to mind from our reading today. It changes the way you might feel as the host of this theoretical banquet, doesn't it? To know that when you welcome the marginalized to your table, it's like you are welcoming Christ himself. It might change the way you look at your guests, knowing that they are bearers of divinity. They are reflections of the image of God. They are like little Christs, as Martin Luther would say. They may not be able to repay your hospitality, but what a gift it is to be able to serve Christ in the form of your neighbor. In Jesus' parable that we heard, the setting is a dinner party, a banquet table. It's a setting Jesus uses often for his parables. Of course, the layers of meaning in a parable mean that a dinner party is never just a dinner party. Jesus isn't only talking about seeing the presence of God in your neighbor when you sit down to eat. Jesus is talking about seeing the presence of God in your neighbor all the time, in all the moments of your lives. Jesus isn't asking people to only change their actions towards those in need, but to change their outlook altogether. This helps us move beyond the trap of sentimentality about the idea of loving your neighbor. Jesus doesn't say to serve people in need when they're pleasant to you, or when they're well-behaved, or when they're full of gratitude. Jesus says to serve them regardless, because all people should be welcomed and treated with dignity. When I was in college, I volunteered at a food distribution program that ran itself like a restaurant. So guests would come into this colorfully decorated room. They would be seated at a table. Volunteer servers like myself would come and take their order. We had this menu of meal options for the day. I remember this one day in particular when I brought food to a guest who was really disgruntled with the food that I brought. He wanted his eggs over easy and they came scrambled, or he wanted rye toast when he got wheat. I don't remember the specifics, but I remember well the feeling of humiliation and discomfort I had when he yelled at me in a room full of people. I had to go walk into the kitchen and cry for a few minutes to recover. It was an uncomfortable experience, but also it was an important check on my own attitude towards this man. It was easy to think, I'm a volunteer. How can he yell at me? Or this food is free for him. How can he make demands about his order? But that was the whole point. He didn't simply leave his personality or preferences at the door just because he was in need. This was an opportunity for him to sit down at a table, order the meal he wanted the way he wanted, and be served by someone else, treated like a guest, not a beggar. And this was an important opportunity for me to remember that he was a real person, a bearer of God's image, not a prop to make me feel better. I am not defending his yelling at me. I would rather have had his polite gratitude than his ire. But I admit that the chance to serve him was a blessing in a way for me because it taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. It changed my perspective about how to serve. We don't live with generosity and hospitality because it earns us points, either with society or with God. We live with generosity and hospitality because we have been loved abundantly by God, even when we didn't deserve it. We've been saying it every week in our confession at the beginning of worship. Even when we were dead in sin, God, who is rich in mercy, loved us and made us alive together with Christ. We reflect the radical welcome of God that we have received. We'll proclaim that in our hymn of the day today when we ask God to gather us in, all of us, the lost and the forsaken, the rich and the proud, those in need and those with too much, all of us. God gathers us all at the banquet table, feeds us all, no matter who we are, and sends us out to love one another. Thanks be to the God who loves us and calls us to love. Amen.